Good morning, everybody. I hope you are well. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'm going to read out my latest blog post, which introduces some ideas emerging from my research. And I was going to take a few breaks at certain points to really expand on certain ideas. Hopefully this will make my research more accessible to people in different fields. People who have had questions all the way along about some of the terms that I'm using and why I've chosen to use those particular terms. All right, so let's get into it. The blog post is called Introducing the Mesotopia, Living Between Physical and Symbolic Worlds. So what I'm talking about here is the process of meaning making and how we express that meaning through signs or symbols or communicative events. So I often begin by saying that my approach to meaning making differs sharply from the purely materialist assumption that there is a real world and it can be known. The Mesotopian position, by contrast, begins from the more unsettling but, I think, more honest claim there is a real world, but it can never be completely known. This is not a retreat into relativism or mysticism. Indeed, I argue for demystifying the process of meaning making. I advance a philosophy of embodied recognition that every act of knowing is situated, partial, and mediated through the strange vehicle of human experience. In the Mesotopia, meaning arises not from the fixed solidity of matter, nor from the abstract play of language, but in the dynamic lived zone where sensing, thinking, and doing meet. The prefix meso means middle, and it's in this middle terrain that I locate philosophy as a practice, not as a system. It's a space of tension, friction, and constant negotiation, where perception and intuition interweave to produce what we take to be the real. So I'm just going to interrupt there. What we mean by materialism in that context really is the sort of the prevailing idea of knowledge making that has been around in thought or academic discourse or scientific discourse for the last 120, 130 years or whatever. This idea that through empirical research, things can be documented, evidenced, and known. And I suppose there's always been a pushback since that time, since you could even say like the Romantics was very much a pushback to this idea that all things can be known. Well, I argue that my research and my expeditions have shown that we always reach a moment of conjecture whenever we're doing environmental research, in that there are certain things that continually elude our understanding or our knowing. And we incorporate those ideas into our notion of what reality is. So therefore, intuition about things, basically like an educated guess, becomes a part of meaning making. So a huge part of what we consider to be the real is based on educated guesses, right? I don't think this is controversial. I think most people understand what I mean by that. So what I'm saying is, well, okay, that's fine. But when you are trying to make communicative events, or like, for example, environmental poetry, which is one of the things that I was working with, or any other kind of cultural artifact, you are basing it in a large part on evidence that is achieved through intuition, right? So rather than dismissing intuition or educated guesswork, which a lot of materialist research does, I'm saying, actually, why don't we incorporate that? And it doesn't have to be mystical or religious in tone. It can actually be a part of the factoring into how we understand our relationship to the environment. Okay, back to the blog post. Materialism offers the comfort of certainty, a belief that if we look hard enough, we can strip away illusion and stand before reality as it truly is. The Mesotopian approach rejects that fantasy. Instead, it invites us to dwell in partial revelation, to see knowledge as a series of embodied engagements that illuminate fragments of the world while inevitably casting others into shadow. What we call understanding is not the conquest of the unknown, but a dance with its irreducible strangeness. This is where the idea of weirdness enters. In my work, weirdness isn't about the quirky or bizarre, but about that unsettling quality that appears when reality refuses to be fully domesticated by human thought or desire. The weird announces itself when our conceptual frameworks falter, when the world shows itself to be more alive, more complex, more surprising than our categories allow. Weirdness, then, is not an obstacle to meaning, but the sign of meaning's vitality. It's the pulse that reminds us we are both active and passive participants in a strange confederation of things that keep their secrets. So what I'm saying there is that this kind of intuition, this not knowing that's factored into our meaning making really becomes a way that we articulate our relationship to the environment. And it's that kind of weirdness, that intuition that reminds us actually that we do live in a very vital environment. And we are constantly being confronted with and challenged by things that we don't know and will never understand. And that's actually, weirdness is actually a part of environmental being, right? And then you think, well, if our cultural artifacts, such as in my case that I work with, lyrical poetry, language is an articulation of our meaning making based on our environmental perception, well, how we perceive this environment, how we interact with it, really does influence or impact how we respond to it through our meaning making process, which I go into a lot later. So in the Mesotopia, back to the final bit of this blog post, in the Mesotopia, to encounter weirdness is to encounter reality itself. Our bodies, our gestures, our creative acts, these are not secondary to thought, but integral to it. The way we move, speak, and make art are all ways of negotiating that strange boundary between what can be known and what forever escapes categorization. Philosophy, in this sense, becomes an art of attunement, a way of staying sensitive to the rhythms of a world that exceeds our grasp. So, the Mesotopian project is neither to master the real nor to deny it. It is to inhabit it, to live in that fertile middle space where knowledge and mystery coexist, where the world's weirdness is not a problem to solve, but a companion to think with. To be Mesotopian is to make meaning a bodily act, to feel thought as movement, and to accept joyfully that the real will always remain just beyond the horizon of what we can name. As always, Miath Kar. So what I'm suggesting here really is, I'm not the first person to do this and I don't claim to be, there is this middle space really between the material and the immaterial, so to speak. And this discussion or this discourse or debate has been going on for many, many years. I'm not the first person to investigate this terrain. How I situate the Mesotopia as being slightly different from these others is many of these kind of these theses or research into the terrain between the material and the symbolic, they tend to frame it as being liminal, right? Almost as if it's a process of becoming. I disagree. I don't think there's an element of progression here or becoming. I think it's much weirder than that and stranger in that once we perceive a metaphysical or a world in which the human being or the human perspective is not the only central perspective to everything, right? Once we realize there are other things out there with their own motivations and intentions beyond our ability to understand them, then once you sort of decenter the human from that and just think about, well, yeah, these are just strange, weird encounters, and we perceive them in a certain way. We don't understand something, and therefore we use our intuition to come to the best educated guess of what that is. Now, once we start to try and organize that into symbolic codings or linguistic codings or any kind of communicative event, then we have to make certain decisions and our intuition kicks in. So I suggest that a huge amount of how we understand our environment is based on intuition. And I think that should be something that we factor in to every decision we make about negotiating our way through environmental being and responding to that in either a cultural, communicative, or artistic way. So I'll be doing some more posts like this as I go through to talk about things coming out of my research. Link to the blog post in the details below. There's also a link to my thesis published on the University of Plymouth's archives. So have a look at that if you want to go into the weeds of what I'm talking about there. And I will be posting next week. I'll be regularly posting once a week, really, to discuss some of these ideas from my research, because I think it's a good way to help it clarify in my mind as I'm talking and thinking and processing what actually came out of the past 10 years of my life. Yes, I was doing this for 10 years. Anyway, thank you very much, and I wish you a really good week, and see you next Sunday. Thank you.